Thank you, David. So for today's topic, again, as David mentioned, on Russia and NATO and Israel's relations. So Russia's war in Ukraine continues to generate instability in Europe, and as part of its broader strategy in the face of Moscow's threats, NATO is expanding its collaboration with Israel. Here at FELNET, we focus on strengthening Israel-European relations. We pay grave attention to what will this increased cooperation will look like, and how will these strategic developments impact Israel, Europe, and the Middle East in a more broader sense. With us today, we have Rina Bassist, an Israeli journalist who monitors Israel's pulse. She has been serving for many years as an international correspondent for the Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation, stationed in Paris, Brussels, New Orleans, and Pretoria. She also contributes to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Jerusalem Post, and Ynet. Prior to her journalistic career, she served as also in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Deputy Ambassador in Bogota. Today, although, she joins us from Equatorial Guinea. So as FELNET, we are a broad organization. We have representation in every continent. And most recently, Rina wrote an article about the relations between NATO and Israel and how they're increasingly getting closer. In a much broader context, before I leave the floor to Rina, it's interesting to see how NATO from a couple of years ago went from, as President Macron said, from being brain dead essentially, to NATO's Secretariat in February 2021, publishing a roadmap of reforms and different strategies for the future up until 2030. Within that context, and then a year later, we have the war in Ukraine that changed completely also NATO's situation and status with regards to European nations and even in the more global arena. So for the latest updates and what we're going to discuss about today, I'm leaving the floor for Rina, please.
Thank you much for the process.
Rina, we're having the connection is slightly shaky.
Can you hear me better now? I'll talk a bit stronger.
Can you try that again?
Now, is it better?
Go ahead.
You might want to close the camera, Rina. The sound might go better.
Let's hear you now, Rina. Try again.
Shall we? Again, both for David and for Daniel for the very kind introduction. And Daniel was very correct in saying that NATO has been going through different processes in recent years. Two processes today I propose. First of all, the process of the last, and then of course what's been going on in NATO in the context of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So let's start with the longer process, the one that we I'll go back to the time of President Trump's administration. And I don't know how many of you followed, but President Trump had two very problematic, quote unquote, NATO summits in 2018 and 2019. Both of these summits didn't go very well, and President Trump didn't hide his skepticism over for the US relations with NATO. Daniel mentioned the very dramatic, if I may say so, statement by French President Macron in 2019, saying that he thought that NATO is suffering from brain death. And this was, in a way, it was some sort of a watershed moment, I think, for the alliance. a year later, when President Biden came into office, he picked up on that, if you may say so, and things started to change. And the change was very, very significant. And Daniel, you mentioned the roadmap last year. This new concept of NATO was adopted just a few days ago at the NATO summit in Madrid, end of June. And this process of change, it's not just the US getting back into NATO. It's much broader than that. It's NATO saying that the whole idea of a military alliance, in a way, is a little bit obsolete because the world has changed, and NATO, like many other international organizations, must look in a much, much wider way. This means that NATO needs to be more oriented towards technology, innovation, cyber, of course, military or civil, issues like civil resilience. I mean, that's an issue we are all talking about for many years in Israel, but there are many countries in Europe called home front security.
Rina, I think we lost you. Rina, do you mind maybe trying just to turn off your camera? Maybe the sound will work better.
So, can you hear me better now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. You saw me at the beginning, so at least you know how I look like.
It's okay.
I'm saying that since the election of President Biden, NATO has started a sort of a process of change, which is not just related to relations between the US and NATO, but in much a bigger way, looking into innovation, looking into new technologies, looking into climate change, looking into civil resilience, etc., etc. And all these changes that were adopted actually just 2 weeks, 29th, 30th of June at the NATO Madrid summit. Of course, these changes affect also, in a very significant way, relations with Israel. Why is that? In domains like civil resilience. I see that you're not hearing me very well.
It's back. Go on.
It's back. So Israel has special, very special capabilities in civil resilience. Just a little example. In Israel, we know how to make a plane land on a tarmac when weather is very, very hot without its wheels exploding. It's a silly little example maybe, but it's something that Israel knows how to do. So we know how to do that, and we know how to do something also that NATO starts realizing is very important, is relying and connecting with the private sector. I mean, NATO is used to working with security industries. But now NATO understands that it needs to work also with the private sector, and Israel is very special in that, that it knows how to build an envelope. What does it mean, an envelope? An envelope means that maybe it's let's say the Ministry of Economy, the Innovation Authority, the startup companies, the greenhouse structure, all of these entities know how to work together in order to promote these projects. So this sort of envelope is very, very interesting for NATO. And we had last week, I'm a journalist, so I like always to use examples of things that just happen now. And we had last week a very, very interesting delegation coming to Israel. It was a delegation of a body called the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. Now, this is not a body that is subjected to the NATO Secretariat. It's a sort of advisory body that is composed of parliamentarians from all the member countries of NATO, of the 30 countries, both opposition and coalition. So we had 22 parliamentarians from NATO countries coming, all of them members of a subcommittee for technology. Why is that interesting? Because we didn't have any NATO Parliamentary Assembly delegation for at least 5 or 6 years coming to Israel. And the delegation that now came is, as I said, the subcommittee for technology, which means that NATO understands that the relationship it has with Israel should change for the benefits of both sides. And I would also like to say something very interesting from my talks with several Israeli diplomats. And maybe it's not very characteristic in general to look far ahead, but that I have to say, the change of NATO. Yes,
I'm sorry, we lost just your last sentence. If you could just repeat the last sentence, please.
Yes, I'm saying that it might not be very characteristic for Israel to think long term. But in this case, the change that NATO has been undergoing for the past 5 years, definitely Israeli diplomats realized that almost from the beginning, which is why we start now already, even though the process is at its beginning, we start already seeing some fruits. And I can tell from my talks with different Israeli diplomats that this
I'm sorry, Rina?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah,
I'm here.
So again, just 5 seconds behind.
Shall I repeat the last one? I'm saying
please.
that what's interesting is that often Israeli diplomats, they look at the moment. You know, we are very much in Israel, we are very much focused on the moment. I think David started by talking a little bit about the situation in Israel, and we had the Knesset dissolved, and we had we have a new prime minister, and we have soon elections, the 5th one. So we are always very, very much geared on the moment. But when you talk about this process that NATO has been undergoing, I must say that from the impression I had, from talks I had with Israeli diplomats, I can say that the Israeli Foreign Ministry realized these changes that NATO has been going almost from the beginning. So that's very interesting. And I can see already that there is some sort of a NATO community being built up in Israel, people from the Defense Ministry, from the Economy Ministry, NATO. Little by little, the Foreign Ministry is getting them on board, and that's a change that is very, very visible.
Yes. Okay, so let me just deconstruct all of this very, very big amount of information and this very contextualization of NATO in the past few years. And obviously, within all of these changes, we've also had the war in Ukraine that kind of shook everything around. Us here at FELNET, we saw it from the first row, as we had a German delegation, a defense committee coming here and looking to broaden their security cooperation. So as you said, the military assistance or the defense community of Israel is something that is very for granted, but now Europeans are looking also for in different fields. And we saw also Baltic countries and Poland who are looking into fields more related to national resilience and PTSD and home front, as you said, that NATO is looking more into investing in these new fields. And this is a big opportunity for Israel. And how do you see basically Israel stepping into this field more in a more strong way with European countries, but not necessarily only with NATO? How will that go in the context of the war in Ukraine?
Daniel, if you will just allow me, I'll say one more word about, because we spoke about the more undergoing, has been undergoing, still is undergoing. But of course, since February 24, since the invasion of Russia, and this is also something that Israel must take into account. You spoke a little bit about Israel's relations with NATO, and we know that it's been already 3 decades of relations. Throughout these years, at least the first 20 years of Israel-NATO relations, our ties with NATO were evolving mostly within what we call which was some sort of a framework that was parallel to the Barcelona process of the European Union, and we had also the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which also had its own Mediterranean initiative. For years, Israel was operating with this framework. There were ups and downs, and we'll talk later on when we talk about, we will surely talk about the downs. But in a way, I think we can say that the invasion into Ukraine changed that. Why did it change it? Because NATO, by the force of things, is now looking much more to the east than to the south. This is force. We don't.
So you're saying basically that NATO is. I'm sorry, you were just a little bit cut out. So let me just see if I understood correctly. So NATO is turning to the east instead of to the west. In what sense?
Well, I would say not to the instead of the west, but instead of the south. This means that we are going back a little bit to what NATO was when it was first conceived, and all the efforts of the last few years about this dialogue, this Mediterranean dialogue, of course, they are put aside for the moment because nobody can focus on both scenes, on both areas at the same time. So NATO is completely geared towards east of Europe, and Israel must think about its how much participation in the Mediterranean dialogue form, how much we bring to it. In a way, what I'm saying is that the added value of Israel geographically might diminish. We are in the Mediterranean basin. This is where we are. In the coming years, because attention will be elsewhere. Attention will be elsewhere. But, and then this is where both processes connect. Our added value geographically might diminish, but our value in terms of capabilities can grow. And this is all the capabilities we spoke about. Of course, interest between climate change, all of these things, all of these capabilities and expertise, these can contribute a new kind of relations that Israel could establish with NATO. And I think in a way, from what I gather from my talks with Israeli diplomats, Israel has already started. So we are accepting the fact. Yeah, please.
So in that context, when we see how NATO is shifting and changing their geographical priorities, And we saw most recently that Sweden and Finland have been asked to join NATO. And our relations with the Scandinavian countries and Baltic countries have been somewhat unstable, let's say, in the last few years, or not necessarily a priority. And as you said, maybe our geographical advantage is different. So what's our take? What's Israel's opportunity with the new shift towards Scandinavia?
Well, this is very interesting because I don't know how much everybody knows about Israel's exact situation, Israel's exact status vis-a-vis NATO. We started, of course, as what NATO calls a non-NATO ally, but then we got upgraded into the status of a non-NATO major ally. Okay, there are 40 countries that are allies of NATO, and then there are only 19 major non-NATO major ally. And I think the fact that Finland and Sweden, who were outside of NATO, are now coming in, it only reinforces, first of all, the looking to the east, because of course, for Finland and for Sweden, the Ukrainian arena and everything that goes around with it, this is their first priority. Not the basin countries, but there are other advantages as well, because this reinforces, of course, Finland and Sweden are countries that also have advanced security industries, countries that are interested in what we mentioned before, civil resilience issues, respect. So this, I think, reinforces this trend Israel must adopt now of changing its relations with NATO. I could perhaps go maybe into a few details on what these changes, how Israel can benefit from the changing, from the evolving relations with NATO. We spoke about the military dimension diminishing perhaps a bit, but it still exists, of course. And what's interesting for us is, in a way, and here I'm not talking about industries, but I'm talking more about what Israel can learn from NATO members. You know, working together, working in a multilateral environment is not a work vis-a-vis the Americans, and we know very well to work vis-a-vis the Germans or vis-a-vis the Brits, but working with many countries time.
Rina, so if I'm getting correctly what you're saying, the fact that NATO is a multilateral platform is a bit more challenging for Israel, because what we know best is to do bilateral relations, and NATO is obviously a multilateral organization, coalition even. So it's more challenging for Israel?
Yes. Why is it an opportunity for us? It's an opportunity. I spoke last week with an Israeli diplomat who told me how in Israel the Navy has difficulty speaking the same language as the Air Force, which has difficulties speaking the verbal language, but on other levels. And in a way, this is everything is standardized. A soldier a Slovak soldier would know how to talk about how to communicate with a Czech soldier, and it's not because both of them will speak English or French or whatever other language they know. It's because all the procedures were standardized. They know how both of them for an helicopter to land on I don't know, a very short piece of land. For both of them, they would have the same procedure in front of them, and this is something that Israeli security agencies can very well learn from NATO. So that's something that we can learn from them.
So let me ask you this: in light of what you're just saying, that there's some sort of standardization of NATO, where do you put Turkey in all of this? Because as much as NATO might speak the same language between each other, we've seen that there is some sort of clash between members of the coalition, especially regarding security and defense. When Sweden and Finland have asked to join, Turkey now might speak the same language, but tend to disagree.
Oh, absolutely, but for us, I think for Israel, it's even more complicated. We must take it even beyond Finland and Sweden and look into our relation with Turkey, because, and this is also something that several Israeli diplomats told me, NATO has become, and that's not new, this has been going on for many years as a sort of litmus paper or a way to test our relations with Turkey. When relations with Turkey are bad, you see it immediately in the NATO arena. I mean, there were years when Israel diplomats could not even get a room to have a conference inside the Brussels headquarters, because the Turkish representative would say no or veto it in any other way. When relations with when Prime Minister Netanyahu, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, apologized in 2016 to the Turks over the Mavi Marmara flotilla, this had immediate implications inside NATO. First of all, Israel was allowed to participate after many years that Turkey vetoed in the Black Mountain military drill. So that was a very tangible result of it. And 1 year later, Turkey in the headquarters. So NATO serves like a very significant declaration. Many countries,
let me ask you this:
members of NATO, non-members of NATO, and Turkey.
So let me ask you this, in the context of what you're saying, that NATO serves as a platform for us to get closer to Turkey, and in the broader context of the Abraham Accords, do you think that NATO could be a platform as well to get in contact with other countries, or even broaden what NATO is, or even to take it even further away in a dreamy way, to maybe have another coalition in the Middle East, NATO-like? Maybe that's something that we can learn from our experience walking around Brussels corridors?
I think there have been many talks, many publications in the last few months about Israel's desire to establish some sort of a NATO-like alliance in our region. And obviously, NATO can serve as a model. Now, I think it would be a bit presumptuous to think that we can reach the same level as cooperation as you can find inside NATO, to have the same model exactly in the mid, very big, very optimistic vision. But on the other hand, we shouldn't rule it out, and maybe we can have a small NATO-like NATO alliance. We have seen already, Israel has already signed security cooperation agreements with Morocco, with Bahrain. So why not turn it into something more institutionalized, more established? And of course, as David mentioned before, we are just 2 days before President Biden arrives not a NATO-like model in his mind or in his planning for the very near future, but maybe in the bit longer future. Why not?